Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the next conversation in our discussion series, History and Biography, in the company of Dr. Ramchandra Guha and Professor Srinath Raghavan. While in the popular imagination, as well as in academic enterprises, the realms of history and biography are viewed as separate, even antithetical, they are closely intertwined. Any account of the past must consider the lives of people who made up that moment in time, and equally, no individual life can be dissociated from the historical events that make up their time. Yet, few scholars have been adept at studying both. We hope to bridge this gap through today's discussion, when our panelists will focus on the relationship between these two modes of engaging with the past and the challenges of practicing both. We are fortunate to have with us today one of the few scholars to have mastered the grounds of both history and biography, Dr. Ramchandra Guha, as well as Professor Srinath Raghavan, whose illuminating books on history are very well known. Dr. Ramchandra Guha, as everybody knows, is an Indian historian, environmentalist and writer, whose research interests include social, political, environmental, and Qriket history, and the field of economics. He is an important authority on the history of modern India and a recipient of the 2019 Honorary Foreign Member Prize conferred by the American Historical Association. He is a trustee of the New India Foundation Fellowship Program and a columnist for The Telegraph, Hindustan Times, and the Hindi daily newspaper Amar Ujala. His books include a 2-volume biography of Gandhi, each chosen by the New York Times as a notable book of the year. Professor Srinath Raghavan is Professor of International Relations and History at Ashoka University and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has previously taught at King's College London and has worked at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Professor Raghavan has served as a member of the National Security Advisory Board and was Chief Editor of the Kargil War History for the Ministry of Defense, Government of India. Prior to entering academia, he spent 6 years as an infantry officer in the Indian Army. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you both, Dr. Guha and Professor Raghavan, to today's discussion. We are delighted to have you with us, and I will now turn the evening over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prathiti, for that very kind introduction. Good evening, Ram. Very good to see you here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about these two sort of parts of, broadly speaking, I think the historian's craft, which is the writing of history per se, but also biography as a route to understanding and explaining history. And I think you're one of the people who's really straddled both of these in the Indian context. So I just want to begin perhaps by, just asking you what you think is the reason for a certain kind of a divide, particularly in the academic study and practice of history. I recall reading an American Historical Review, which is a flagship journal of the American historical profession. They had a roundtable some years ago called Historians and Biography. And practically every historian who entered the roundtable was almost at pains to say that they were not a biographer proper, but that they were just a historian. And this includes a very distinguished historian of South Asia who's written books on Gandhi and Nehru, who began her essay by saying that, I really don't think of myself as a biographer, because biographers are in some ways telling a cradle to grave story, whereas we historians are engaged in a different sort of an enterprise, right? And then the editorial introduction to that AHR special issue actually said something to the effect that biography remains the sort of neglected stepchild of history, which is most often kept out of the door, but maybe from time to time allowed in. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the reason for this kind of a divide between two different approaches to the past, which must in some ways be seen intuitively complementary, but are nevertheless not seen to be as such?
So I think, see that the aversion to biography among professional historians is A, partly relatively recent, and B, varies from culture to culture. So I think in the American Academy, the resistance to professional university tenured historians writing biography is greatest. And this is partly because history has increasingly moved from being a branch of literature to becoming a branch of social science. And when you think of history as social science, individuals matter less, and broader processes, structures matter more. Uh, Also, that's, I think, one very important reason. I think in Britain, on the other hand, um, biography still remains quite a central part of the historical tradition. And I think professional historians sometimes identify biography as archaic, antiquarian, very 19th century, glorifying great men and less often great women. It was satirized and mocked in E.H. Carr's very influential book, What is History? So I think the peculiarity and individuality of a life doesn't really attract historians unless they are also more oriented towards literature. I myself believe that history is both a branch of literature and of social science. And a good historian must obviously learn to write well, must probe mentalities, emotions, sentiments, but at the same time be aware of broader structural factors that shape how human beings move and act. In India, I think I have argued in the past that the resistance to biography, which is now fortunately breaking down, was intensified by the domination of Marxist historians in particularly influential Indian universities like JNU and Calcutta. And Marxists disparage, underplay the influence of individuals, and maybe oddly enough by our religious tradition, Hinduism, which in which the individual life does not matter, because if you're dead, you're reborn as something else. For example, unlike Islam or Christianity, we don't have a hagiographical tradition of lives of the saints and the bishops and the archbishops. Now, one Indian historian, as you know, I think two Indian historians have of an earlier generation to me, I think defied this prejudice against biographical writing. One was Sarvapalli Gopal, whose works you've edited and whose work you know much better than I do, and I think who was shaped by living in England. And the other was B.R. Nanda, who was liberated by never being inside the academy at all. Right. So I think now many young scholars are moving towards writing biography. I mean, we can discuss it on your own ongoing biographical project. And I believe every historian at some stage of their career would find it exciting, challenging, fulfilling, and even invigorating to write at least one biography. I'm not saying become a full-fledged biographer. I'm not saying abandon social science. I'm not saying, narrow yourself to being a specialist in biography. But it's a different kind of literary and intellectual challenge, which I think historians would enjoy if they take to it.
Let me ask you a slightly more personal sort of entry point into the same question, really. I mean, you began your career effectively as a sociologist.
Correct.
You were trained in sociology, social theory. I think your early work, particularly on, the peasant protests around forests and environment in the Garhwal Himalaya, was very much in the sort of idiom of social history. In fact, you could even say sociological history. I'm thinking of Unquiet Woods, which
that's right.
self-consciously presents itself as a work both of sociology as well as history. And you wrote at that point of time also in many of the sort of leading sort of contributions of Indian history, like Subaltern Studies, where one of your early articles was published. So you were very much part of the social history kind of mood. And some of that milieu was, as you have written yourself, Marxist in its own way.
Yeah.
I think there have been Marxists who are exceptions to the trend of despising biography. I think your own hero, E.B. Thompson, began by writing a life of William Morris. I can think of Christopher Hill, who wrote a life of Oliver Cromwell. Of course, there is Isaac Deutscher, who was more or less a biographer too. But I was just wondering, so what then leads someone like you, who is so steeped in a certain kind of radical social historiography, which is so much the cutting edge at that point in time, to say that you actually want to then move away towards working on the life of a not so well-known Englishman who spent a lot of time in India, called very relevant. I'm just curious, how does one come around to making those kinds of choices?
So I think it happened through a series of accidents and events. Well, first of all, I owed a profound debt to Elwyn, because Elwyn changed my life. Before I became a sociologist, I was trying to become an economist, and I was spectacularly unsuccessful in that pursuit. And as I like to say, I didn't take to economics, and economics took even less to me. Now, when I was doing my MA in economics, I did a BA in economics. And when I did my MA in economics, I stumbled upon the work of Arian Irvin purely by accident. And I was enchanted by his prose style, his description of Adivasi life. And I thought this is something I can relate to, I can engage with, and maybe having failed as an economist, I may yet succeed as a sociologist, as a social anthropologist. So Elvin is the reason I did a PhD in sociology. Then I took up a research topic which you mentioned on the forests of the Himalaya and the interaction between villagers and state forests. And then Elvin comes back because Elvin actually writes very insightfully and movingly about the curbs placed on tribal use of the forest by the colonial forest department. Then I got interested in Gandhi, and then Elvin was a kind of a renegade disciple of Gandhi. So at some stage, I decided I must settle my accounts with Elvin. He became so important in my academic life that I began work on this biography. But I was very, very hesitant to begin with. So when I first started working on Elvin, my project traveled under the title, The Tribal Question in Modern India. So it was going to be an intellectual history of debates about the Adivasi and the Adivasi predicament and their place in the political and social history of modern India. Then an element became more important in my project. The tribal question in modern India became very relevant in the tribal question in modern India. Then I started reading his private papers. I had the opportunity early in my career to spend a term at Oxford and go every day to the India Office Library, which was then located not where it is now as part of the main British Library in St. Pancras, but the south of the river in a very gloomy building on Blackfriars Bridge Road. And reading his personal letters to his mother, to his sister, to his English friends, I decided to dump the tribal question, but I still wasn't sure that I wanted to go the whole hog and write about Elvin's personal life. So the third title under which my project traveled was Verrier Elvin, an intellectual biography. So I was still hesitant because of my sociological training, because of my social scientific kind of background in actually probing his life and his moods and his emotions and his relationships and his marriages and his loves. And then, of course, finally, it became both a personal and an intellectual biography. And in this whole transition from sociology to history to biography, a crucial role was played by my first editor, who was also your first editor, Rukun Advani, who was kind of nudging me along, understanding my anxieties, telling me what to look for, what not to say, how to craft my argument. And I think had it not been for Rukun and the British scholar Nicholas Boyle, whom I also happened to meet at that time, I probably would not have become a full-fledged biographer. I would have still have seen myself as a student of ideas and written really about Elvin's anthropological work without really going with any depth or seriousness into his personal life. So I think that's how it happened. But I owed a lot to Elvin. I mean, Elvin changed my life. I mean, Elvin saved me, rescued me from professional, you could say, failure, more or less, by giving me a second chance to become an anthropologist and sociologist. Yeah.
I remember reading a review by the historian and biographer, David Gilmour. I think it was in the Times Literary Supplement, if I'm not mistaken, where he said something to the effect that your biography of Elvin was, a very rare case where the biographer and the subject were very well matched. He said, this is a book about an enthusiast written by an enthusiast. So, no, but even allowing for a certain kind of an, intellectual affinity, as it were, with Elvin. By this time, you were also an established writer. You had already written a couple of books on Qriket. I think you were writing reasonably often in the press, perhaps not as widely as you began to later in your career. So I would imagine that, writerly anxieties were not part of the challenges that you faced. You mentioned briefly about Nicholas Boyle, the great biographer of Gotha, with whom I think you overlapped in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, what were the kind of models that you had in mind? What were the exemplars you were looking at?
So you mentioned David Gilmour, whom I got to know around the time I was writing my book on Elvin. And what I said earlier in the conversation, Srinath, that there's a more developed tradition of biographical writing in Britain than there is in America. I mean, certainly a tradition of greater subtlety and insight. And I was reading people like David Gilmour, his life on Lampedusa, who was kind of a minor eccentric figure, just like Elwin, although he wrote a bestseller, The Leopard, which Elwin never did. I was reading A.N. Wilson, who wrote a wonderful life of Tolstoy. I was reading Victoria Glendinning, and other kinds of biographers. And then I happened to meet Nicholas Boyle and overlap with him for a year in Berlin. And about the lessons he taught me, I think, again, if there are any writers here who are in the audience who want to write a biography, about the lessons, two crucial lessons that Nicholas Boyle taught me. One is that when you're writing about someone who has left a large body of a paper trail that is massive. For example, later on I wrote about Gandhi. There are 90 volumes of Gandhi and so on. Elwin himself wrote about 40 books, 200 newspaper articles, and reams of letters, private letters that were available. And Nicholas Boyle said, don't rely only on what your subject is left behind. Look for letters, documents, reports, articles written by other people that bear on your subject's life and work. That's so look for sources other than that emanating from your subject yourself. So I think that's one very important lesson he taught me. And I think that's a lesson, unfortunately, Sarvapalli Gopal, someone both of us admire, didn't really heed. His biography on Nehru is largely based on Nehru's writings and letters. His biography on Radhakrishnan is likewise based largely on what the philosopher himself left behind. So that's one thing. Look for perspectives on your subject that are not come from your subject's own pen, especially if your subject is a prolific writer. The second lesson that Nicholas Boyle taught me is that think of a biography as a play with many characters in which your subject is only one. So it's in your subject's relationships, his relationship with his friends, his parents, his children, his enemies, his adversaries, his lovers, his rivals, that his own personality and character really emerge. Now, and I think that's another very important lesson that I took to heart in my work on Elwin. And of course, later on, when I came to Gandhi, which is as much about Gandhi's rivals, adversaries, friends, associates, as it is about Gandhi himself. Now, to that, I did a third lesson, which I learned on my own, which is never be inhibited even if your subject is left behind an autobiography. For example, Elwin's autobiography is a beautiful work. The Tribal World of Edward Elwin. It's eloquent, moving, rich in detail. And when I was working on this book, this is the 80s and 90s, there were still older Indians who knew Elwin and had read his autobiography, which won the Sahitya Academy Award, which essentially is very rare for a work of non-fiction to win the Sahitya Academy Award. And people had read it and would ask me, what new will I find in your book which is not there in Elwin's biography? And the more I researched, the more I dug in, I realized that an autobiography is essentially a preemptive strike against a future biographer. Elwin wanted to give his version of his life and put it out there as a record. And that's what Gandhi also did later. And of course, Nehru and other people who've written Darwin and other people who've written their autobiographies. And there's lots in Elwin's autobiography, there are lots of holes and gaps. And of course, you have, which the biographer can fill in. The biographer has distance, detachment, can take the wider social and historical view, which a autobiographer cannot, and so on. So I think it took me a very long time. As you said, I write a great deal, and writing usually comes quite easily to me. But my book on Elwin went through about 7 drafts. It's gone through more drafts than any other. Usually, when I revise a book, it's cutting and chopping and refining. But here, I could restructure the whole narrative based on, my unlearning, my sociological and historical background, and becoming a proper biographer.
Go back to the earlier question. So, what do you think the Elwin biography enabled you to do, which you could not have done had this simply been the tribal question in India?
I think his life was so fascinating. And of course, I brought in the debates and so on. And certainly one could write a complimentary book. Someone else who's got a more analytical perspective than me and who's not so personally obsessed with Elwin could write a larger history of the tribal question in 20th century India, which has not been done. There have been books on the Dalit question, the Muslim question, the women's question, and there's probably a really good book to be written. So essentially, You know, I had to focus on Elvin because of what Elvin meant to me personally. But I think still I would say, though I'm too old and probably too tired and jaded to write that kind of book, intellectual history of debates about Adivasis from the 19th century till today, you know, I think would be a very valuable contribution which a younger scholar could make.
And move things forward a little bit. As soon as you finished the Elvin biography, you went back to another kind of social history work, which is your book on the social history of cricket in India, right? Which was again very explicitly conceived, or at least cast as a sociological history rather than a narrative history. And but at the same time, one of the prime protagonists of that book is Palwankar Balu, and so it seems that the biographer does sort of sneak into the sociologist's book by that time.
Yeah, I think that book it kind of, in some ways, is synthesizes whatever I had learned as a sociologist, a historian, and as a biographer. The grid or the structure of the book is very sociological. So the 4 parts are called race, caste, religion, and nation. Which are broad sociological categories. Of course, it uses primary materials, but the figure of Balu is a central to the book, because there's this Dalit cricketer who had to fight prejudice and stereotypes to do what he could. So, in a sense, and of course, it also married my love of history with my love of cricket. And I think there are lots of things one can do in even when writing a larger work. Even if it's not explicitly a biographical study, even if it's a work of social history. A 10-page portrait of an individual whose life and anxieties and controversies may illuminate a larger theme. For example, if you read a very nice book which both of us have read, published by the young Naga scholar Kanato Chofi, it's a broader social history of religion in Nagaland, but it's got stuff on the early American missionaries. It's got interesting new material on Fizo, on Rani Gedilu, and that kind of, through that you can tell a much larger picture. Though it's not a biographical study, and actually it's a social history. But I think even works conceived as social history, if they at particular points in their narrative, they pick on an individual. I think that's where biography and history can meet. Even in a work conceived as history, short biographical portraits sometimes integrated. For example, a book which is not a biography per se, but is biographical history, is Eric Hobsbawm's Bandits, which has many different bandits, illustrating a larger sociological theme, which he calls social banditry, and its prevalence, particularly in Latin America and parts of backward parts of Europe, right? So I think even if one does not write a full-fledged biography, historians would be well advised to bring in cameo portraits of individuals, to read widely in biography, to acquire the skill and the understanding and the interest, to even put cameo portraits of individuals to tell a larger story. You're writing about a peasant movement, but maybe the leader or the second in command, 5 or 8 pages about that person can tell you can give you insights which are kind of a bland, anodyne sociological analysis cannot do. So biography humanizes history, and actually it also brings history to the general reader. So even if your work is not conceived as a biography, I think you could do a lot by bringing in individuals more centrally into the narrative. That is usually the case with historical research.
You spoke about writing for the general reader, and it seems to me that a lot of historians and people who write biographies, one of the reasons that they choose that as the medium is because they simply believe that that's the one which has the broadest appeal amongst all forms of writing about the past. Has that been your experience? Do you sort of buy into that kind of presupposition?
Yes and no. I think probably in terms of the market, there's a problem with writing biographies of interesting minor figures. And let me give you an illustration of my personal experience. Now, my book on Elvin, again, this is something I hope younger writers might take heart from. My book on Elvin was published by OUP in India. but it was rejected by 30 publishers or maybe 33 publishers abroad, now including by British publishers. And one of the well-known British biographers, Peter Hopker, told me, he said, the problem with the biography market is either the subject or the writer has to be well-known. So if you are writing the 800 biography of Napoleon, if you are unknown, which is what I was then, and you are writing the 800 biography of Napoleon, you will be published. If you are well-known, if Vikram Seth instead of me, back in the year 1989, when Vikram Seth was 1990 something, when Vikram Seth had just published Suitable Boy, if he was writing a life on Elvin, he would get published. So either the writer or the subject has to be well. And that is sometimes a pity, because some of the most interesting people are actually these kind of intermediate figures. I happen to write on Elvin, but I'm now going back to writing on relatively minor figures. And my new book, Revels in the Raj, is kind of, like Elvin, 7 Elvin-like figures. Palvankar Balu, other kinds of people. And often it's these intermediate figures who provide the most interesting perspective on society, because they deal with the bottom and with the top. But the biography market is massively oriented towards great men, great women. I hope that changes. I think one of the very good books, I mean, every year there's a book on Gandhi, a book on Nehru, a book on Ambedkar. I think about half a dozen books on Ambedkar are apparently coming out this year, right? Now, or this year and the next. I think like one of the very good, again, if I may give an Indian example of a book I really admire. I've spoken of Kanato's book on, which is kind of a social history, not a biography. But a good recent biography is Dinyar Patel's book on Dadabhai Nauroji. Now, there's been no book on Nauroji for 80 years. And even the book that was published 80 years ago was rather superficial and hagiographic. But here is someone who has brought pre-Gandhian nationalism to life through his study of a single individual. Now, so I think that's a route many people can go, that they can flesh out an entire epoch, an entire movement through one individual. And there are many lives one can tell. I mean, and it's not just true of India, it's true of many of South Asian countries. I mean, there too, the biographical tradition is relatively undeveloped. I mean, you work on Bangladesh. Is there a really good book on Sheikh Mujibur Rahman? Is there a good book on a fascinating character, two fascinating characters from the early history of East Pakistan, Fazlul Haq and Suravardi? Is there, look at Pakistan, there's virtually nothing, no really good biographical studies of interesting characters in Pakistan. BP Koirala of Nepal, one would love to read a good life of him. So I think there are lots of, South Asia particularly, is I think potentially a very rich field for biographical study.
But why do you think then the field hasn't kind of delivered the crop of books that we're seeing? I mean, is it partly because to write a good biography, you need access to organized archives, papers of various kinds? Like, for instance, I'm trying to work on the life of the astrophysicist Subramaniam Chandrasekhar. And one of the great things about doing the project is that his archive is extremely well organized. It's in the University of Chicago. It's easy to sort of get through. Whereas I suppose with most biographical subjects, that is unlikely to obtain in the context of South Asia. So
there are many reasons, Srinath. I mean, I've mentioned a few. The dominance of Marxism, which is now happily past. The Hindu inhibition about writing about a defined life. The lack of access to papers, which you mentioned about. Sometimes, social pressures. Can you write a really frank book on Ambedkar or Savarkar, without running into political trouble? Sometimes family opposition. Then the fact that it is a very difficult art form. Writing social history is much easier than writing a good biography. From the point of view of crafting a narrative, from the point of view of telling a story compellingly, biography brings you closer to fiction. It is not fiction because you're under oath, you can't invent dialogue and facts, but there has to be a probing of emotions and understanding of relationships, a sensitivity to style, to narrative, which other historians need not necessarily have. But there's one more reason, Srinath, and this was conveyed to me by my friend Mukul Keshavan. One more reason why good historians don't write biographies. And that, the way Mukul Keshavan put it is, he said, writers and scholars have a great deal of self-regard. Apne ko bahut samajhte hain. They think they're important people, right? To write a biography, You have to submerge your ego in somebody else's life. You have to say this person is more important than me, and spend 5 years. Now, what you're doing is so you have to really. Whereas to write about a whole culture, a whole society. So, writing about Bengal since 1947 is more gratifying to the historian's sense of self-importance. I'm writing about a big theme, Bengal since 1947, compared to, let me write a life of Mahasweta Devi, whose career is parallel to those 70 years since 47, but it's just one individual among 100 million Bengalis, right? So I think it means a recognition that this person is important enough for you to spend several years only on her, not on the wider society. But I think this might change partly because I think it is a way of telling, bringing history to a much wider audience. And again, I'd like to repeat, one does not have to write only a biography does not mean a single individual. Even if it is a single individual, like Gandhi or Ambedkar or Savarkar or Subramaniam Chandrasekhar or Indira Gandhi or M.S. Subbulakshmi, it's about a constellation of individuals around which that person's life is told. It could be a group biography, like my book Rebels Against the Raj is about 7 people. It could be social history peppered and interspersed with cameo portraits of individuals who could be, who could be peasants, who could be women. I mean, one of the very nice short pieces of biographical writing, which I'm sure, written by a historian, which I'm sure you also admire, is Ranajit Guha's essay Chandra's Death. So there are different ways of merging history and biography, which need not necessarily be conventional, need not just be a 400-page book about one person.
And Richard Eaton's sort of biographical sketches
on the Deccan, fantastic book. Those 8 lines, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So, how then did you come to sort of choose a figure like Gandhi as a subject? Right? Because A is so written about. I think perhaps one of the most written about figures in 20th century history.
Yeah.
Secondly, it must have been an extraordinary commitment of time, right? Because some of these really big biographies take years to work out, as we are seeing with Lyndon Johnson's, biographer Robert Caro. He's almost in his 80s, I presume, and still, I don't think we've still gotten to the point where the Vietnam War has gotten going. Yeah. Or I also think of another book that I admire a lot, which is the Irish historian Roy Foster's biography of William Butler Yeats. Yeah. Which again, I believe he worked for about 25 years. Yeah. And your Gandhi book also was in the making for at least a couple of decades, if not longer. So I'm just wondering, how do you sort of commit to that kind of a time commitment to a subject?
So I think, Srinath, it took me a long time to decide to write a biography of Gandhi. I always knew I wanted to write a book on Gandhi. But as you say, there's so many books on Gandhi already there. Well, there's several reasons. One, I think, is personal, which is that wherever I went, Gandhi was following me. I wrote on the environmentalism and the Chipko movement activists were inspired by Gandhi. I wrote on Elwin, and as I said, he had an intense, complicated relationship with Gandhi. He was kind of a rebellious son. Then I wrote on Qriket, and I didn't expect to find Gandhi. But Gandhi's views on religion and caste were shaping what was happening on the cricket field. And when I compiled the index to a column of foreign field, to my surprise, I found about 40 references to Gandhi, even though Gandhi never played or watched cricket, essentially, right? And then I wrote India after Gandhi, and as the title itself shows, it's kind of a continuation of this country after Gandhi's death. So I think that's one thing. I felt I must settle my accounts with Gandhi because he's kind of shadowed me all my life. But so it was kind of a personal reason. The other reason was intellectual, which is that in the course of my research on other topics, I found all kinds of material on Gandhi, which is not in the collected works. In archives in different countries, I had learned to use local newspapers, and I saw how rich they were as a source for understanding the Gandhian movements of the 20s and 30s. Much later, when I started working on South Africa, I discovered the South African newspapers, which previous biographers had not really at all used. And finally, there was a vast hoard of Gandhi's own papers that no previous biographer had seen and had just been made available at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. It's a long story about why those papers were kept hidden for so long, and we need not go into it. But while I was writing my biography on Gandhi, these papers were made available, They were indexed and catalogued under the supervision of an excellent archivist whom you know, called Deepa Bhatnagar, and Dr. N. Balakrishnan. These two fantastic archivists opened up this archive of Gandhi's private papers from the 30s and 40s, his correspondence with all kinds of people, lots of interesting documents and reports on very important events like the Noakhali March and what happened in the Aga Khan Palace and so on and so forth. So there was lots of new material I had. And I wanted to write a 1-volume book, but then I realized how important South Africa was. So it became a 2-volume book. And obviously, it took many, many years. Essentially, it was kind of, I suppose I'd been thinking about Gandhi for a very long time, from maybe not my first years as a researcher, but from the late 80s. In the late 80s, I'd started reviewing books on Gandhi. So among the books on Gandhi I reviewed were by Bhikkhu Parikh, Rajmohan Gandhi, I think Judith Brown, and I started reading a lot around Gandhi. Ashish Nandi's writings on Gandhi, Dennis Dalton, who wrote some of the most insightful stuff on Gandhi. I was reviewing books on Gandhi in public. I was referring books on Gandhi in private for publishers. Among the 2 books I read, which I think are first rate on Gandhi, were by 2 foreign scholars. Dennis Dalton's book on Gandhi that I mentioned, and a wonderful study of Gandhi's religious thought by the Belgian scholar who settled in Australia called J.T.F. Jordan. So I was reading a lot of secondary literature on Gandhi. I was doing primary research and finding Gandhi. And finally, I decided to, write a proper biography of Gandhi, which took a decade and more. And I mean, Gandhi will be there till my end of my days. I'm sure that in my new book also, all the 7 characters essentially have different kinds of relationships with Gandhi. Sometimes deferential, sometimes adversarial, sometimes both deferential and adversarial at different points of time. Yeah, but it was a kind of exception in that, I would say maybe an aberration, in that previously I had written portraits of relatively less known people. And here I was writing, as I said, the 500th or the 1000th life of Gandhi, but I don't regret it. Yeah.
And to flip the question that I asked earlier around, did you feel that there were things that you might have wanted to do, which the biographical form did not allow you to, even though you took 2 substantial volumes to do? And might you want to do something like that in the future?
Yes, absolutely. I would like, not immediately, but one day to write a more interpretive, analytical, argumentative book about Gandhi and his ideas. Kind of a social theory, political theory kind of book about Gandhi, with not this kind of rich biographical detail, but more about his ideas and how they've been debated and contested over the years. I've also got interested in something which is very arcane and specialized, but I think one day I'll write a short book on that, which is the making of the collected works. If you look at the 97 volume of Gandhi's collected works, they're a meticulous work of editorial scholarship. And certainly the government of India today, if it wanted to do the collected works of someone, would not be able to assemble a team of scholars to do that kind of work. So I think there are other odd things I want to do around Gandhi, but one certainly is a more interpretive, argumentative book about what is the meaning and legacy of Gandhi's ideas about caste, about gender, about religion, about non-violence, and so on. I think that's something which you can't do really in a biographical form. Absolutely. Yeah.
More lately, you've also sort of entered into another domain of writing, which is broadly, we may call it the memoir. And I'm just wondering, how does the experience of writing a memoir actually tell you something about what the challenges of the biographer might be? You referred to some of those earlier.
Yeah. I'm sure, I'm not writing about my life per se. I wrote about my life in cricket. And I have been doing other kinds of memoiristic writing, which I may not publish in a hurry. But it's kind of much more literary. A memoir is like the next step, because really, in a sense, you could call it vanity, egotistic, but I see the memoir really as a way in which you can link your life to the times you're living in. Obviously, I'm a relatively insignificant figure in the history of modern India, but I've had the privilege of, through the course of my life, of meeting many unusual and remarkable people. My cricketing memoir is a cricketing one, it's about great cricketers I watched, seen, and then, of course, I was also catapulted into working with BCCI. At one stage, I wanted to write a book, which I won't anymore, which is a personal memoir of all the remarkable environmentalists I have known, like Medha Patkar, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Shivaram Karant, and so on. But I don't really think that will hang together. Yeah, it's kind of it's just you as an observer, a witness of interesting, unusual times, people by interesting, unusual people, whom you can watch. And sometimes you can write about them in 4,500 or 4,000, 5,000 words, as I have done about many of the people who inspired me and moved me, E.P. Thompson included. But sometimes they fit into a larger kind of scheme. So it's a kind of you could say, it is slightly, if not egotistic, at least self-indulgent and voyeuristic to write a memoir. But I'm at a stage of my life and old enough when I think I can indulge myself.
You've written also quite insightfully about the challenges of writing the history of the very near past, contemporary history, as you might call it. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about writing the biography of a subject who's perhaps still alive? I mean, do you think such an enterprise can actually take off?
I thought about this. I think it's a mistake to write about a person who's alive, unless they are in active politics. So books about Modi, Rahul Gandhi, Putin, Angela Merkel are fine. But if you want to write about, shall we say, to take two good biographies that have been published recently about Indian musicians, Ravi Shankar by Oliver Krasker and M.S. Subbulakshmi by Keshav Desiraju. It's good that they came out after the subject had died and the entire arc of the life had been completed. So I think books about people who are still alive, unless they are active serving politicians. You want to know why Putin is invading Ukraine, you want to know why Modi's politics of a certain kind, write a book which is kind of partly biographical, partly political critique and political analysis. That would be fine. But I don't think they should, anyone apart from a serving active politician or head of state, a biography of that person should wait till they're dead.
You spoke earlier about the relationship between biography and history from the other side, right? So far, we've been talking a lot about what biography can tell us about times, histories, and so on. But you also said that, you could think of and conceive of histories as effectively being conveyed through biographical set pieces, vignettes, call it what you want to, right?
Yeah.
And then clearly, India After Gandhi was, I think, one book where that particular model was very, clearly sort of attempted. I'm just wondering, what led you to sort of think about, even think about the political history of India, primarily in the context of personalities, whereas, there is a very rich literature in political science which will tell you that there is a Congress system, there is its decline, and various other kinds of ways of thinking about the same.
I think it just emerged, India After Gandhi, of all the books I've written, Srinath, India After Gandhi was the only book that was somebody else's idea. Every book I've written so far, every book I will write in future, is self-directed, self-motivated. I decide to write on the Himalaya, I write Elwin, on Qriket, on Gandhi, or anything else. India After Gandhi was a publisher's suggestion. And I was just whistling in the dark. So I had to find my own way around this subject. As you know, Indian historians only wrote about the pre-independence period. So I had to find a structure, a narrative. I had to decide what themes to include, what themes not to include, or where to look for materials. There wasn't a clearly defined archival corpus I could raid, which, unlike in Gandhi, I knew where I had to go. And everything emerged very kind of spontaneously, organically while I was writing. And these capsule portraits of individuals. Now, obviously, the book has a great deal on big guys and one big woman who's Indira Gandhi. So it has a lot on Ambedkar, Patel, Nehru, and so on. But I really enjoyed the set pieces about middle range figures. Sukumar Sen, our first chief election commissioner, for example, or Tarlok Singh, who settled, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who helped settle the refugees. So some of these, or Lal Dhenga, the leader of the Mizo rebellion. So I think all that was really enjoyable, and I think that's that's something which I hope younger historians could also follow. These set pieces. India After Gandhi is not biographical history. It is political and social history. But these crisp portraits, for example, these short portraits, I think can illuminate larger political, social, historical processes. And I think in that sense, I enjoyed that very much. But it just emerged as it was going along. I realized that I should tell a story not just about Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel and Indira Gandhi and Jayaprakash Narayan, but also about these other characters, lesser known characters who shaped the making of Indian history.
Your most recent book is, takes this to a slightly different kind of a plane because it's quite explicitly conceived as a sort of a connected set of biographies with an attempt to illuminate one particular aspect of modern Indian history, which is what is the role of sort of sympathetic outsiders, as it were, in the making of this nation. So I was just wondering, I mean, how did you conceive of this project, and could you tell us a bit?
So this is a long-delayed sequel to my Elwyn book. So my Elwyn book, while working on the Elwyn book, I came across several of the characters in this book, not all, and I wanted to write a companion volume, which got delayed for multiple reasons. I didn't want to write a broader history of India's encounters with the modern West. So I restricted myself to people who had been arrested or deported, which has offended some people because because that rather rigid definition excluded such remarkable individuals as Sister Nivedita and C.F. Andrews, for example. But I thought I must, focus it around this theme of real dissent, real rebellion. What I enjoyed about this book, Srinath, I mean, I enjoyed lots of things about writing this book, but it's the first time I've written with any intent about women. So 3 out of the 7 characters are women, right? And that was not all my previous biographical subjects have been male. I mean, Elwyn, Palwankar Balu, Gandhi, of course, the main characters of India after Gandhi. So that was a challenge. And if I was to write another biography, I would like to write about someone who's not Indian at all. I think that's something, I don't know who that could be. I thought of writing about E.P. Thompson, by the way, but his papers are close to 50 years. I don't know why, but his family has closed them. So I'll be dead by the time they're open. So I think writing about women was a different kind of challenge. I think that's something, and all formidable women, Annie Besant, Mirabai, and Sarla Ben. I'm not sure I could carry off. I'm not sure who a female figure in Indian history would be on whom I could carry off a full-fledged biography. But I enjoyed writing about them, and I would now like, if I was to write another biography, which is not very likely, I wouldn't rule it out. I think it'll probably be about someone who's not Indian at all.
Okay, that's fascinating. But biographies are so much about uncovering the context within which an individual is formed, raised, works, and so on. So I'm just wondering, in your latest book, you also do something for the first time, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you've written about American figures. Most of your previous, biographical figures have been either British or Indian. Whereas here you have Americans, and then they come from a very different cultural, social milieu. So I'm just wondering, what are the challenges of straddling so many different backgrounds? So,
Stokes and Gaitan, 2 of the 7 American, both originally missionaries, and one converted to Hinduism and the other did not convert, but kind of left his church. Of course, it draws you into a new culture, a new perspective. I mean, I come from a generation of Indians who knew Britain at second hand better than any other Western country. I mean, young Indians today of a certain class background may be much more American oriented than I was, right? But I was lucky enough to live and teach in America, so know something about that society from the inside. Annie Besant is partly Irish, so a little bit of Ireland also came into this book, and of course Ireland has Roy Foster, whom you mentioned, whose work shows is not really part of the broader British cultural acumen. Not necessarily, right? So I think, yes, I mean, unfortunately, I don't have the languages, So of course, there are lots of interesting French people who worked in India. I mean, you think of the mother of Pondicherry, for example, or the scholars like Alain Delanoux, or some of the filmmakers like Renoir. I mean, the French encounter with India, and of course, it goes back right to the 17th century and so on. It could be very interesting. There's a colleague of mine at Qriket, John Matthew, who has just written not yet published, a first-rate history of animal science and animal research in India dating back to the 16th century. And the French figure in his book. So do the British, so do the Indians. But he, unlike me, reads French. So he has which is very good. And he has some lovely insights into maverick French scientists working in India, right? If you go back to the distant period, of course, you could bring in China, right? So I think so yes, I mean, bringing in two Americans and one Irish woman was relatively new for me. And as I said, I wish I could I had the skills to bring in French and German and Chinese people as well, but maybe younger scholars will.
And how important are those kinds of language skills in Indian languages itself? I mean, for instance, I can imagine you could have written a biography of Gandhi without having to read Gujarati simply because of the profusion of materials.
So absolutely. I mean, for example, say someone like Patel, okay, or Rajaji. They've been, again, I mentioned Rajmohan Gandhi. Two of whose best books are on Patel and Rajaji. And they're both very well researched, very competent, very judicious in their analysis, and well worth reading even today. But the book on Rajaji does not use Tamil sources, and the book on Patel barely uses Gujarati sources. So they're very good books, but they wait. A younger scholar can take our understanding of Rajaji further if he or she knows Tamil, and of Patel even further, or he or she knows Gujarati. I mean, to write about Nehru, Hindi helps a bit, but not that very much. Gandhi, I know Hindi. Gujarati, I got quite a lot of letters translated by a very fine Gujarati scholar called Urvish Kothari. But with Patel, there's much more in Gujarati because he's essentially a figure of Gujarat. Rajaji, among other things, was a pioneering short story writer in Tamil, and lots of his correspondence is in Tamil. So yes, absolutely. I mean, to write biographies of such people, you would have to know the languages quite well.
And can you think of any outstanding exemplars of biography in Indian languages? I mean, I can think of one, which is Amrit Rai's biography of his father, Munshi Premchand.
I also don't know others. I mean, one would have to talk to people. Sure. There must be some which are hidden and forgotten. There must be some early lives of some of the figures of the Bengali Renaissance, for example, written in Bangla, which have not been translated adequately yet. Probably some stuff in Maharashtra, one doesn't know. Yeah.
I want to sort of finish this conversation by talking a little bit about, getting you to reflect a little bit on the state of biography as an art form in India today. When you began, there was hardly much of a tradition of writing this way. I mean, you mentioned a couple of very distinguished, forebears, people like Sarvapalli Gopal and others who have been done this kind of work. But over the years, I mean, how do you see that particular scene having changed? Where do you think there are things still need to be done? What are the brighter spots in this landscape? Tell us a little bit.
I think it's a very vast and fertile field waiting to be tilled. I think it'll grow and grow. I think there will be more stuff written on the ancient period, the medieval period, the modern period. But it takes a lot of investment. So particularly if you choose an unfashionable subject, like someone like Elwin, who's fascinating and interesting and intriguing. I mean, there are lots of people, Elwin-like figures. I mentioned Mahashweta Devi some time ago. But if you look at Maharashtra, for example, someone like Iravati Karve, the anthropologist and literary figure, or P.K. Atre, who was a campaigning editor, filmmaker, who shaped the Samyukta Maharashtra movement. I mean, in Kerala, E.M.S. Namboodiripad. I mean, every state has half a dozen interesting, unusual figures of the 20th century alone, not of earlier periods. I would myself like to read about, right? So it's a very very exciting field, but it's a very challenging genre. A scholar or a writer has to be willing to invest several years and do the research and craft a narrative and learn how to write elegantly and well and accessibly and tell a very human story. And I think younger Indians will take to it, or even foreigners writing on India will take to it. I think I've just been reading a new biography of Ashoka, which will come out next year, by the great Sri Lankan scholar who teaches in America, Patrick Oliver, right? And I think it's really the most readable book on Ashoka I think I've certainly ever read, and I've read several. And it's wonderfully moving, empathetic. It draws on a lifetime of scholarship. So that even someone like Ashoka, you can tell a story afresh. I've also been reading a book by a younger scholar, Chitralekha Joshi, a manuscript again on Sheikh Abdullah, another interesting, complicated, contested figure. That also hopefully come out soon next year. And I want to, one of the nice things is, that engaging with these people, you learn. And I think biography is a field that will grow, but you have to be disciplined, rigorous, do the primary research, stay away from hagiography, stay away from catching a prevalent political fashion. I want to write about X because certain political parties in power, they might buy 5,000 copies of my book and sell it. Stay away from all that, because that won't last, So treat it as a literary and intellectual and scholarly challenge and give it your best. And I think you'll enjoy it. I think Dinyar's book on Nauroji is a model for what younger scholars should be doing.
On that note, Ram, I think we should open up the conversations. I can see a lot of questions already in the Q&A chat. So, Pratiti, do you want to come in at this point and steer the conversation?
Yes, thank you for that. And we do have a lot of questions. We have an audience watching on the YouTube channel as well. And so we have questions from both channels. So I'm going to start with a question by Arunji. And this is directed to Dr. Guha. He says, as a researcher, social scientist, and a social scientist while writing biographies, are there any challenges that you faced in terms of bias while using methodology?
No, I think every writer, every scholar has unconscious biases. They have to find a way of overcoming it, of looking at different kinds of sources but the human being in all his or her complexity must come out, and I think that's social scientists are inhibited from writing about biography because they don't want to probe emotions and sentiments and relationships. And as Walt Whitman says, each one of us contains multitudes. So you shouldn't shy away from, writing about the dark side of an individual, for example, even an individual you might otherwise admire. But a biography in that sense comes closer to literature than to social science. So to repeat a point I made earlier, a great deal of unlearning has to take place when a social scientist writes a biography.
Next question comes from Debashish Sen. He has two questions. The first is, while working on a biography, have you ever come across sources or references which you subsequently realized were actually leading you away from biographical or historical truths? And the second part of his question is, would you like to mention any interesting aspect that caught you by surprise while writing the biographies of Elvin or Gandhi? And which less known or not so well known fact you were subsequently happy to include in these biographies?
Yeah, so I think I'd say something about the second point. I think what was interesting about writing about Gandhi was, of course, the range of sources I discovered, but the range of characters who had shaped him. For example, in South Africa, these maverick English people his Jewish friend Henry Pollack, for example, his secretary Sonia Schlesien, who played such an important role in his life, who were like Patel and Nehru and Rajaji were in his life in India and had been kind of written out of the narrative. When it comes to Gandhi's Indian phase, the person who I most enjoyed working on was Mahadev Desai, who was in many ways Gandhi's head, heart, and hand, but was such a self-effacing man that he had written himself out of the Gandhi narrative. So I think these secondary characters, the characters who actually made Gandhi, I think, and who don't generally appear in the biographies, I think that they take you over, and you want to write more about them. Of course, they include Sarla Devi Chaudhrani, Tagore's niece, the singer and poet with whom Gandhi had a brief infatuation. So I think lots of unusual people coming. I mean, there are many more I could have written about, but my editor on my Gandhi biography, the late Sunny Mehta, said that there are at least 150 characters in this book who come up, who are not just names on a page, but are individuals in their own right. So in that sense, I think that was really enjoyable about the book, was writing about people other than Gandhi. Again, to go a question that to a fact that relates to an earlier question, something that shows the subject in the dark light. I mean, his first son Harilal and the relationship with Harilal, which of course had been written about previously. I mean, had been documented in C.B. Dalal's, to answer Srinath's book about biography in Indian languages. Chandubai Dalal had written a first-rate book on Harilal in Gujarati, translated by Tridip Surud, with lots of original letters in it. There were also other letters I found in other places, also Harilal's prison record, which is in the South African archives, and to write about this troubled, tormented soul who had essentially been destroyed by his father. Gandhi was a great leader and an original thinker, but a rather disastrous father, particularly when it came to Harilal. So all this, I think, bringing in his relationships and other characters, I think was something which was new to me and was a challenge which I relished meeting.
So next we have a question from Pushpinder Sayal, who asks, do you think biography answers questions about people who would otherwise have remained on the margins of history?
Very much so, very much so. I think that's a very good question. And certainly in my own career, people like Elwin and Palvankar Balu were basically forgotten. And I mean, again, to refer to Ranjit Guha's essay, Chandra's Death, absolutely. And I hope that such relatively marginal people who'd led interesting, unusual lives, but were not transformative figures in the way politicians or generals or entrepreneurs are, that writing about them can illuminate a period, a society, a culture in ways in which, perhaps even more famous people cannot. So that should be a challenge younger scholars can take up.
So now we have a question from Niranjan Rajatyaksh, who says, how does a biographer deal with the complexity of source material in a multilingual country such as India?
No, I think this is a very good question from Niranjan. I think many figures would require material in different languages. So, and sometimes you may have to learn the language. So if I mentioned Dadabhai Naoroji and Dinyar Patel's book on Dadabhai Naoroji. Now, Dinyar Patel is a Parsi who grew up, I think, in California, speaking English. So he had to learn Gujarati. Now, Gujarati is a language widely spoken by Parsis. They had their own kind of inflection, called usually known as Parsi Gujarati. And he had to learn Gujarati and the script and the language to bring in the Gujarati materials. Of course, there's lots and lots of English sources on the Dadabhai. One could have written a whole book on that. Richard Eaton had to learn Bangla to write his book on, the history of religion in Bengal. So knowing the more languages you know, the better a historian you would be, and probably a more skilled biographer. My own greatest regret as an individual, as a writer, and as a scholar is that I never learned a third language. So English and Hindi are my only languages, which restricts what I can write about. Of course, I can get a research assistant to translate stuff for me, but that's not really the same. So again, the person asking the question happens to be multilingual himself, but younger people who are not, who grew up in an English-only environment with a rudimentary understanding of a second language, who want to become scholars, learn a language early, and it does not have to be an Indian language. Srinath Raghavan happens to know Russian. I don't know where he picked it up. I'm not sure whether it was in any defense, in his defense years, or given the importance of Russia to our defense needs, but he knows Russian, and that helped him in his work on Bangladesh, and hopefully he'll go back to using his Russian again. So the more the languages you know, the more of an advantage it is for any historian or a biographer. Srinath, you would like to say something on this, on language skills?
Yeah, I think, even in terms of what you can do with, say, the modern and contemporary history of India, I think it's increasingly becoming clear that, knowing Indian languages is kind of, maybe historians of your generation, Ram, for whom the British and the Indian archives had opened up at that point of time. The official archive loomed very large. But I think now there are diminishing marginal returns to how much you can get out of those kinds of archives. And, the second thing is, I think, what this also opens up is there is a certain kind of democratizing effect which it has, because it means that there are a number of other scholars or people who may not even formally identify themselves as scholars, who are writing, books. Like I was thinking of, there is this book on Savarkar by Biographer, which uses a lot of Marathi material.
Correct.
Which I don't think many of his English language biographers have used in the past. So I think it is precisely that kind of entry point which languages also allow, which I think will be very fascinating for us.
Absolutely. I mean, since you mentioned Beva Purandare, I think I wish more journalists would be writing biographies, because they're steeped in a region. A Bengali journalist, a Tamil journalist knows the region, knows the language, knows the culture, knows the variations across the state, and pick up a subject, a subject from that state, like Savarkar in Maharashtra, or you say someone from Bengal, rather than merely academics. An academic would be restricted in their perspective on Savarkar or on Jyoti Basu, compared to, say, a Bengali journalist who does the research, who's willing to do the hard work, but has a kind of a bottom-up approach and a greater linguistic facility, because the journalist has spoken that language in her work all the time. Right? Absolutely. I mean, again, if I may just add a footnote, in other countries, some of the best biographers are actually journalists. I mean, Joachim Fest, who wrote the great biography of Hitler, the first landmark biography of Hitler, was a journalist. And actually, the only good, you mentioned living people, the only halfway decent book on Narendra Modi is written by a journalist, Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. Okay. Now, so I think journalists would make natural, at least political biographers, maybe not other subjects, but because they would know the language, they would know the region, they would know the context. And so long as they're willing to do the primary research, they may write books that maybe not as analytically sharp or robust as that of a scholar, but have more humanity in them, more empathy, more understanding of the person and where the person is coming from.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of Taylor Branch, who wrote a biography both of Bill Clinton, but also of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, of King and the civil rights movement, parting the waters. Yeah,
that's right.
He's a journalist. Yeah.
We now have a question directed to Professor Raghavan. The questioner asks, in his upcoming biography of the astrophysicist S. Chandrasekhar, how do you tackle and uncover the personal life of the scientist?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that it's upcoming in a somewhat longer term sense. I've just been sort of working on it before the pandemic struck. I think it's a very difficult challenge. I was kind of drawn to the subject partly because as a teenager I studied physics and I wanted to be an astrophysicist. But fortunately for me, I realized that doing a PhD in physics was not my route in life. So in a sense, after all these years, coming back to this through the life of Chandrasekhar, about whom, again, there has been a previous biography which was written in his own lifetime, which perhaps suffers from some of the challenges that Ram referred to. There are a couple of other studies of important sort of controversial episodes in his life, like his controversy with Arthur Stanley Eddington, the great British astrophysicist, which has been much written about. But I think writing the life of a scientist is very challenging because, you can take some of these moments which are very, either controversial and so on, and then make a big deal of that. But the more I've read the Chandra archives, Chandrasekhar himself very resisted that trend because towards the end of his life, when he got the Nobel Prize, he actually made this point. He said, I wish I hadn't gotten this prize because everyone seems to think that the only thing I did which was worth remembering is what was done 50 years ago. And then there is invariably a tendency to sort of say that, this work was then despised, but has been later recognized and so on. Whereas there is a 50-year life ahead, which has so many fascinating things. And for me, this is, writing about science in India is, again, something that, I've learned from my friends like Professor Janvi Phalke and others, who have been pioneers in terms of teaching us how to sort of track scientists in 20th century India. And I think it's a very interesting challenge. I certainly have, still need to do a lot more work, particularly on the more technical aspects of it. I've realized that there is much more to his life. For instance, his extensive correspondence with other scientists are also very illuminating, even if you leave technical aspects out of it. I mean, for instance, there's a very fantastic episode of how Chandrasekhar, is instrumental in making sure that Stephen Hawking, the great mathematical physicist, would actually sort of become a fellow of the Royal Society. The entire episode and the manner in which his fellowship was orchestrated are, I think, things which Hawking's biographers have still not kind of got onto. So I think, as Ram says, when you are lucky when you land up with a good archive, it's a very long life. Much of it was led outside of India. He lived up to 80, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and left India at the age of 19, right? So there's a very extensive correspondence across various facets. And I think it also helps me think about how these various currents of 20th century shape an individual life, right? I mean, being part of the British Empire, emigrating to America in the 1930s at a time when nobody from South Asia is really welcome there, and then living through the Second World War, Cold War, etc.
If I may just add to what Srinath said to answer the question, what are the challenges Srinath will face? And it will emerge only while he's writing it. And he'll be the best judge of how to meet the challenge, is how long should the book should be. Now, for example, David Gilmour, who was mentioned, who's a very distinguished British biographer, whom both Srinath and I know, wrote a 200-page biography of Lampedusa, 250-page, who is this Sicilian aristocrat who left behind an unpublished novel at his death that became a bestseller called The Leopard. Writing a 400-page biography of Kipling and 600 pages on Curzon. And I think the length and the subject are well matched. Right. Now, I wrote two volumes on Gandhi. I wanted to write a third, and then someone told me, don't be crazy. And he was right. This is the American editor, Leon Wieseltier. So it became two. Now, maybe that was too long. Sometimes I feel, I don't know whether I should have done it I don't think I could have done it in one, but I could have maybe made the second volume a little shorter. Now, so I think this is a challenge Srinath will face as he goes along. Chandrasekhar was a great scientist. You have to write about his science, you have to write about his personal life, you have to write about 3 countries he traversed. So India, England, and America, right? Now, so you have to bring all of that in, but you don't want to write a book that's too short, nor do you want to write a book that's too long. You could write 1,000 pages on Napoleon, Churchill, Gandhi, and at a pinch on Einstein, and Darwin possibly. Chandrasekhar is somewhere between 200 and 1,000, but where sweet spot, I think, is something you'll have to figure out when you go along. Yeah,
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So Sri Ganesh Gopalakrishnan has a question that's directed towards both of you. He asks, as scholars inquiring into individual structures and processes through history and biography, what decides the focus of free will in producing concrete outcomes?
Free will.
Yes.
Free will.
Yes.
Okay. Now, see, historians and biographers are different from political theorists and philosophers in that they're guided by what they find in their archives. The archive will tell them, their primary research will tell them how much is structure, how much is free will. It's not an abstract concept. And it differs from individual to individual, society to society, time period to time period. Marx famously said that individuals don't make history except in conditions that are given to them. I'm slightly misquoting him. But it's really the archive that tells you and your research that will lead you to conclude as to how much of what an individual did was determined by the time she lived in and how much was her own motivation and self-direction. So, in that sense, it'll differ from subject to subject and from what the archives tell you in one case to what the archives tell you in another case. See that?
Yeah, maybe, one way to think about this question is through the life of and work of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre in the 1950s began this very large project, which resulted in one short volume called The Question for Method, and then 2 volumes called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, right? Which was effectively a philosophical treatise devoted to this question of what is the relationship between individual agency and structure. How can you think about it as a Marxist and so on? And then sometime in the mid-60s, Sartre abandoned the project. And later on, he began working on what became a massive multi-volume biography of the French writer Flaubert. And, he never completed that either because it already ran into, I think, 4 or 5 volumes by the time Sartre was working on it. And in the mid-70s, there is a very interesting interview that Perry Anderson did with Sartre and asked him saying, why did you abandon CDR? He said, I just got tired of just talking about this stuff. I just decided that, the only way to find all these things out is to actually do it. So I think a lot of this is actually in the doing. Philosophical resolutions of these problems, I think, in the abstract are always going to be difficult. The judgment of the biographer or the historian, as Ram says, is, I think, much more dependent on the context, the evidence, and so on. And as Sartre says, the only answer is to do it right.
Next, we have a question from Vijay Kumar Taraknala, who asks, what would be your response to Gandhi's view in Hind Swaraj of history as a record of an interruption of the course of nature? He also quotes an English proverb that says, a nation which has no history is a happy nation.
Yeah. I think history, well, my sense is, obviously, Gandhi has many other interesting things to say about history. For example, Hind Swaraj was written in 1909 and he lived another 40 years. Much later on, and he says something about history which is utterly pertinent to our present times, which is when he was reading a historical novel by the Gujarati writer K.M. Munshi, which absolutely demonized the Muslims. And Gandhi pointed out that even the British have done some good things, and so have the Muslims. And when you write the history, you have to write about the good deeds as well as the evil deeds of everyone. So Gandhi is not really a good guide on how to write or how not to write history, except that history to me is a way of understanding the past without necessarily providing any lessons for the present. So in that sense, I depart from many professional historians who want to intervene in policy making today. I think history enlarges your understanding of other societies, other cultures. It's a branch of education in the best sense, in the broadest sense of the term. But it's neither, indispensable to, human life, nor is it as dispensable as historians think, nor is it as dispensable as Gandhi seemed to suggest in Hind Swaraj. One of the lessons historians can learn from Gandhi, and probably from Tagore, is to write an anti-chauvinist history. When I was young, I was told you have to write Marxist history, and the archives frequently upturned what could be a Marxist history. Now I'm told I have to write nationalist history. Now I don't know what that means. Hindus always good, India always good. Gandhi, if you read Gandhi carefully, he's a guide against anti-chauvinist history. I think that's what historians can learn from Gandhi. History is not about projecting a particular point of view, favoring a particular community, a particular linguistic region, a particular caste, a particular nation. History is multidimensional, diverse, and resists pigeonholing or stereotyping according to religious or cultural or national identities.
It looks like we are kind of running out of time, but there is not a question so much as a comment in the chat box, which reminds us that today is your birthday. So wish you many happy returns of the day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Pratiti. I think Pratiti is seen here. Rupa, are you around?
Yes. Thank you, Sina.
Yeah, I think Pratiti has just come back. Pratiti, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm so sorry about that.
No worries. So are we out of time or?
No, we have time for the last couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Nikita Mehra asks, this is a question for Dr. Guha. Is oral history a better way of recording information, especially when multiple sources are going to contribute to the foundation and making of a biography?
So oral history is useful, but it's one among many kinds of sources that you can use. And it's useful to provide context, but should not be relied upon as hard fact. Memory is fallible. I'm now this is my 64th birthday, and I often misremember even aspects about my own personal history. When I met someone, what was said in a conversation between me and a teacher. So oral history provides context. It can certainly be used to flesh out the broader picture. But if, for example, to give you an example, if a letter is written by your subject in 1924 saying this is what happened, and 40 years later, your subject gives an oral interview saying this is what happened on July 1st, 1924, believe the letter and not the later oral testimony. So oral testimony is valuable as context, but it is a written contemporary source about the same event. Use that as precedence in constructing your narrative. But of course, often there isn't a written contemporary source, so you have to rely on oral history, and I'm glad that many people are using this technique.
Anup Kumar asks, George Bernard Shaw famously wrote an essay saying all autobiographies are lies. In the same vein, is it the case that all biographies cannot really critique a person with the complexity inherent in life stories? That is, a historical lens cannot be avoided, and choices are made concerning what is worthy to be told and what not.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very good point. I'd say biography, like history, is part of an ongoing conversation. I think the Dutch historian Peter Gale famously said, history is an argument without end. So I've written the 500th biography of Gandhi, and people will come on and, nuance my argument, overturn some of my interpretations, take the narrative further. Likewise with works of history. I mean, Sinatra has written an outstanding history of, first of course, our Nehru's foreign policy and war policy, and then about the Bangladesh war. Both are first-rate works, but he doesn't think they're definitive. They're probably better than what came before. And the works that will come later will supersede them or nuance them in different ways. So unlike a work of literature, so George Bernard Shaw was a playwright. Every play is unique and distinctive, whereas every work of history or biography is part of an ongoing conversation. And there's stuff that precedes it, and there's stuff that will come after it. Sridhar, you want to say something?
No. In fact, I think Bernard Shaw's own prefaces to his plays were much more complicated things than the plays themselves, right? So, I mean, even the way that people go about interpreting their own work, I think in some ways, remains challenging. So, yeah, absolutely. I don't think there is any. And I think particularly with biographies, it seems to me, Ram, the challenge is also that you're dealing not just with context, but character. And I think there are shades of light and darkness, as you pointed out, and how much emphasis you place on what kind of a portrait you eventually end up drawing. I think will depend on the temper of the artist rather than.
Absolutely. And I think there's no such thing as a definitive biography. There's an interesting, challenging, evocative biography versus a dull, boring, slanted hagiography. But there's no such thing as a definitive biography for sure. So that's an adjective that should never be used, either for a work of history or for
absolutely.
Absolutely. So publishers love it. Publishers love it, and our publisher is hosting us today. Publishers love it, but scholars should be wary of that adjective. Yeah.
So I'm afraid that's all the time we have now for questions. Professor Raghavan, Dr. Guha, thank you so much for that very engaging and mind-expanding discussion, traversing the realms of history and biography and much that lies between. We also had a very exciting Q&A session. And I know that there are other questions, but I'm afraid we just don't have the time this evening. So those of you who have joined us today and everyone watching us live on YouTube, a very big thank you. Thank you also for posting us your insightful questions. We do hope that you have enjoyed today's discussion. Those who could not attend can watch it on Orient Black Swan YouTube, where all our earlier discussions and talks are also archived and can be accessed. All colleagues at Orient Black Swan involved in today's event, before and behind the scenes, thank you very much. Thank you everyone once again for joining us. I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.